The other thing to mention, I didn't quite realize the number of operating like live reactors around the world. So I didn't realize the US had as much nuclear as it does. There are 93 live nuclear power stations.
Yep.
And then we got sort of China and France at the 50s, and then Russia, Japan, South Korea. So some of these countries have serious investment into nuclear.
31 countries around the world plan to triple nuclear capacity by 2050. So if you're a contractor or if you're someone on a project now, getting experience and riding that learning curve yourself or as a company is a huge opportunity to then take that to the next one,
Yeah.
Going forward. Welcome back to the Offsite Podcast. I'm Jason Lancini and joined again by Carlos Cavallo. One of us sat in a beautiful snowing Germany and the other in a unfortunately not snowing London. How are you, Carlos?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
I am good. I'm just enthralled. It's the first time since we've been here that it's snowed, and it's like Christmas came late/early. It's beautiful.
I saw a couple of days ago in the news, I thought it was worth noting because it's like this week's episode of Black Mirror. The Gulf of Mexico has officially been renamed in Google Maps as the Gulf of USA, as per Donald Trump's request. So, we always knew that he had Zuckerberg, Musk, and Bezos in his hand, but I wasn't so sure that he also controlled Google so strongly. So, yeah, pretty wild.
Awesome. In other news, the content of the podcast has shifted hard from construction to we're now just doing straight politics. We didn't think there was enough US politics podcasts out there.
Yeah, it's too baffling to not mention. But we'll be back on track next week with some solid story about a beaver building a dam.
I didn't actually fact check that, but I did get a message saying that it was maybe dubious in factual origin.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Which I refuse to believe. I think definitely still true.
There's at least 4 websites that have it, albeit all 4 look a bit suspect. But
yeah, between them they have 120 visitors a year or something. The 4 websites. Yeah.
And never let the truth get in the way of a good story anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The truth starts now in the conversation. We're going to talk about we're talking about a lot of big projects that have been, on radar. So some new, some in the news recently. So we're going to kick off by discussing really triggered by an article in the Financial Times talking about big nuclear energy construction, specifically in the UK, and the trajectory of project delivery and this idea of, the articles will all point to massive cost escalation of these projects and talk about whether there's a pattern that's just going to continue happening or what's going on behind the scenes. Then we're going to dive into again, mega schemes. So there is an Olympics approaching for Brisbane in Australia. There is a lot of conversation across that country about infrastructure for the Olympics and a lot of conversation about the ability to deliver that infrastructure from construction workforce side, from general contractor side. And we're going to talk a little bit about the complexity of delivering simultaneously games infrastructure, related infrastructure, housing, etc. And then final one is still to be outdone, but kind of coming in strong. The recent announcement from France in response to the Stargate news that we talked about last week, with a massive 109 billion euro investment into AI infrastructure and data centers across France, making France the kind of European AI hub. And again, what that means for the industry. So number one, nuclear power, and specifically starting with Sizewell in the UK and Hinkley Point C. So a recent article in the Financial Times in the UK dives into the upcoming Sizewell C project, so a major large nuclear power station project planned and soon to be under construction, if not, Carlos, already under construction to some degree.
Yeah, enabling works have started.
In the UK, and talks about the legacy of the current active project at Hinkley Point. So Hinkley Point C, about 280 miles away on the other side of the country, which has kind of unfortunately joined the trend of major nuclear power stations across the world, where the end cost is double or in the realm of double, and the schedule is late to very, very, very late compared to initial estimates. And the article dives into how Sizewell is planning to and has almost copied 85% of the design or the elements of Hinkley Point C, with this idea of trying to ride the learning curve of construction efficiency and design efficiency. So I guess it raises this question of, is there this negative learning curve idea, an idea that they're actually getting worse and worse the more we learn about building major nuclear power stations? Is the idea of duplicating doing a carbon copying bad ideas, basically, and doomed to have the same outcome? Or is it, okay, let's start riding the learning curve? Yeah, what are your thoughts on the topic, being a UK resident and presumably, not diving into it, Carlos, but presumably a taxpayer that's somewhat contributing to it?
You weren't meant to ask me that on this podcast. No, I think just to give some context, so the latest figures for Hinkley was originally going to be completed this year for 18 billion. It's now 2029 for 46 billion is the estimate in that article. So it's quite an increase in line with other similar nuclear power stations being built in other countries at the moment. Yeah, it's interesting in terms of the copy between Hinkley and Sizewell. I'd like to think someone somewhere grabs a file, hits create a copy, and renames it Sizewell, and that's how easy it is to copy a design. I'm sure it's not that easy, but no, it definitely makes a lot of sense. So there was an interesting stat in that article, which was Hinkley's got 2 reactors. The second one's 30% quicker. So you'd like to think that that's learnings, that's efficiencies, that's all sorts of things that you're working out on the first, replicating on the second. And if we can take that learning onto Sizewell, then hopefully it can improve with each one. And Sizewell, they are forecasting 20% cheaper build than Hinkley on that basis. It seems to be, and you can imagine, it's a safety critical project, not to suggest other projects aren't safety critical, but it's nuclear. There's tens of thousands of people on a site. There's a lot of moving parts, heavy machinery. And in terms of UK regulation, it's an interesting point around as risks emerge, rules get put in place, as we all know, on construction projects. So over time, things are getting tighter and tighter and more difficult to build and more stringent with more rules in place. So you can see why you've got this balance between we're getting the hang of this, we know what we're doing, we're getting more efficient, but then at the same time, you're being sort of restricted in your ability to do things because every time there's an issue or a risk emerges, the rule set's getting tighter. It's a really difficult balance between those two around doing things or repeating things quicker, but also...
if you're in the shoes of the people with decision-making capability around the planning of this, are you looking globally and going, let's kind of find what's working somewhere else and bring that in, even if it's not the same as kind of what we did on Hinkley? Or is it like, we've kind of picked a design or technology, partners and supply chain, and let's just duplicate that and do it as quick and efficient again and start to build that like know-how?
Yeah, so like the major player in Europe is EDF, and they're trying to do a copy and paste across major reactors. And I guess secondary to that, we have the small reactors where like Rolls-Royce and organizations like that are getting involved. And you imagine they are shit hot at a repeatable sort of factory mindset in terms of building parts, delivering these schemes. They're much smaller, so less complexity. But their idea is they're going to do this copy and paste exercise, and I think there's 9 planned for the UK. So it needs to get to that point, and you'd imagine there's then fringe benefits like offsite manufacture because we have standardization and everything's not full custom or bespoke.
So what would you do? What would you do if you're if I was going to say if you're in the position of the politician but you've actually done exactly what the politician would do, which is just
There's no hiding in this podcast. I would not put contractors on target cost arrangements.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Well, I'll put a stake in the sand. I'd definitely do the same thing again. I think the idea of a learning curve is exactly what construction does well. The idea of production, from the very first project that I worked on, the idea that you can do something for the first time, measure how long it took and all of its component parts, turn that into kind of a repeatable process that every time you iterate, we go, what's the cycle time of this thing? Where do we lose time? Where can we, tighten up handoffs? Where can we, optimize resources? And repeat, I think is exactly playing to the strength of what construction as an industry does.
Do you not think they're already doing that?
Well, I think the problems are that, even if you try to copy and paste things, the problem is it's like the first big one that's been built in the country. The workforce has never done these things before. The supply chain has never done these things before. Some of it requires new tooling at like a supplier. Some requires like building whole facilities in terms of the manufacture. And so there's definitely cycle times on the actual project that they will be doing. But then by the time you hit the construction site, there's so many things that are kind of locked in place. Your supply chain set, especially Hinkley, like where it's located, the option set is some of the stuff you are kind of locked into. So there's like tight cycle times in the project, but then there's like broader cycle times and, learning curves to happen at higher and higher levels on the way out. And then there's this other trend, you kind of touched on it, which is like the regulation around this industry that forces each one to be somewhat different than the other. And the like enemy of a learning curve is like bespokeness between the things that you're trying to repeat. If you're trying to do a bridge and every bent or every section of the bridge is different to the one before, you can never get the cycle time like dialed in exactly.
Yeah. But there's
just to like close that thought, sorry to interrupt, but so you end up with these, the increasing regulations, the obligations, around environmental, et cetera, that force each of these things to be so different to the one before. This trend that's happening around countries around the world, we'll see it in the news in France and the thing we're talking about next. We just saw it in the announcement in the US, and the UK is just similarly pushing, again, around reducing regulation to allow more of this nuclear power to be built, will allow more of the elements to be the same as the previous and more quickly ride the learning curve. So I think I would be doubling down into, unless there's something fundamentally flawed, but I don't, from my knowledge, it isn't. I think I would be doubling down into cycle time and as much copy paste as possible.
Yeah, the difficult thing is, take the UK, for example, there isn't a huge pipeline of major nuclear reactors. Like these are the two we know of, and that's it. Mm-hmm. If we exclude the smaller ones. As a contractor, how much time are you really going to invest on that sort of mindset to future-proof the next? When, if you're a Laing O'Rourke who's on Hinkley and Sizewell, after Sizewell, are you really going to be thinking about like, how can we really tighten this up and make it repeatable? So they're not really incentivized to do that. So,
it's small ball though. Like realistically, the UK is a very small part of Europe, like more broadly. And I think there's something like 60 something active nuclear power stations being built around the world right now. And so there might be a small pipeline in the UK, but if, the developers, in this case, EDF, they're obviously French. So their consideration is much broader than the UK. A lot of the contractors bidding on work and winning work on these power stations are much broader than the UK. And it gives them a skill set that they can export to build these projects. You do a good job on one, you get to go on to the next. It's your selling point. We did this, we learned, these things went well, these things didn't go well. We're the one with the learning. So even if there were some things that didn't go well, do you want to take those learnings forward, or do you want to go to someone totally new who could totally shit the bed on the thing again?
Yeah, no, 100%. I guess I was thinking more like Laing O'Rourke doesn't operate in Europe. So that specific example, is that future plans? Is that something they plan to do in Australia where they do have a presence and things like that?
Do you think that they wouldn't? Like if they had the opportunity to joint venture with a Vinci on a on a project or an
Yeah.
Eiffage on a project, it's a train ride away. You can actually drive across the. It's not.
No way.
It's not like you're building it on Mars. So I think definitely. I think if anyone is thinking that way, I'd say get out of the like small island thinking.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. There's definitely an aspect of that. The other thing to mention, I didn't quite realize the number of operating like live reactors around the world. So I didn't realize the US had as much nuclear as it does. There are 93 live nuclear power stations.
Yep.
And then we got sort of China and France at the 50s, and then Russia, Japan, South Korea. So some of these countries have serious investment into nuclear.
31 countries around the world plan to triple nuclear capacity by 2050. So if you're a contractor or if you're someone on a project now, getting experience and riding that learning curve yourself or as a company is a huge opportunity to then take that to the next one, going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Countries like Finland, they've got 5 major nuclear power stations running and only 5 million population. You can see how clean that energy is for almost everyone. So yeah, some have doubled down on it and it's obviously working well. The other thing is, if you can, as a country, if you can build nuclear, build it cheap, and therefore you get cheap energy, you must be more attractive for investment in AI and data centers and all the other things, because it's a really attractive proposition if you can offer cheap energy. It's a really worthwhile investment.
Yeah.
Sure.
Speaking as someone that is in Germany, this will segue on to the next topic, which is around like data centers, the energy source needed for a data center. Actually, it's probably worth even just prepping and diving straight into. That's topic 3. Sorry, let's close that thought. We'll go to topic 2, and then we'll dive into that in the third. There we go. Everyone with me? Good. There's an Olympics coming up, right? And it is in 2032 in Brisbane, in Australia. And there is a growing unrest and awareness of a looming problem, which is that there's something like 7 odd years to deliver infrastructure for the project. There is the need to deliver direct venue infrastructure, like stadiums, support venues, athletes' villages, etc. And then there is the usual thing that cities will try and do is to capture that and build, a legacy around infrastructure. So rail infrastructure, hotels, road infrastructure, parks and public realm. And then that usually drives a population boom, both from the construction activity and from the awareness of the city, which then suddenly drives the need for more commercial or residential housing, etc. And that can create this perfect storm of everything getting built at the same time in the same place, which draws massively on the workforce, the resources, which has the next consequence of like skyrocketing prices of everything. And one of the legacies can be, a massive bill to the whole region and to companies and stuff in the region, unrealistic and unsustainable wages and salaries because of the competition, and then also this like dearth of maybe there's not enough infrastructure work or construction work afterwards, and then suddenly the whole thing cycles back through. So it's almost like this idea of construction is a cyclical industry. It always is some form of this kind of boom and bust, but something like an Olympics has the opportunity to make that into like a mega cycle. So before diving into some of the stats, no, 2 audibles. Let's dive into some of the stats, and then I'll ask you, Carlos, about reflecting of, say, your experience with London Olympics. Is this a cycle that's doomed to repeat? So Brisbane is expected to have about 50 billion worth of total infrastructure in pipeline. They expect to need over 10,000 workers for the Olympics projects alone, excluding ancillary related infrastructure. They're expecting on top of that to need to build something like 14,000 hotel rooms, 20 plus, residential towers for athletes' village. And there is this predicted giant crash of demand between about 2027 and 2029, where the cost of everything is going to go up, the demand for everything is going to go up. Yeah, the contractors and projects will be scrambling for people, for materials, and for resources. And so I guess, first question, is this something that you've seen before?
Yeah, so it's going back a few years now. Didn't quite realize it was 12, 13 years ago. But in general terms, it was seen as a success, the investment in the Olympics in London and the fringe benefits we got from that investment. So the major things or the major aspects was infrastructure. So they used it as an opportunity to effectively fast track spend. It gave the Mayor of London quite a strong card to play to get things done quicker. So they did a capacity project on the Jubilee line, particularly around the Stratford area.
Yeah, it was an extension as well. Did they extend the line up through to Stratford?
Basically, it finished before Stratford before. So it went straight into Stratford and then increased capacity in a few of the stations leading up.
Yep.
There's the London Overground. So, Shoreditch High Street Station and all those overground stations, they were completely new just for that. And they are very well used systems now. There was the DLR extension, which sort of extended some of the lines there. So there was a lot of infrastructure, which was very much needed anyway, but it was an opportunity to accelerate that and make sure it's done for the Olympics. So that was a big win from an infrastructure point of view. There was the Olympic Village, obviously had to be built, but after the Olympics, they turned it into thousands of flats, proper residential flats. So it wasn't a build and demolish or end up with something that wasn't particularly useful. It became, I think it was 3,000 homes built in relatively central London. The sporting venues, so the main Olympic Stadium is now West Ham's football club's stadium. So they resold it on to the Premier League club, or they lease it. Like the Aquatic Centre, the Velodrome, they are all now proper sports facilities. They weren't temporary structures. It's not like a Qatar World Cup where they just demolish them after because who's going to use them? And over the period, I think they estimated 46,000 workers were used to build everything Olympics related. And it was kind of I don't know if someone back in the day tried to plan it this way. You probably think not, but the fact that Crossrail started kind of concurrently and really started to ramp at the end of when the Olympics happened, loads of those workers would have shifted straight across. And I worked with a ton of people that worked in the Olympics. So it almost helped us avoid that lull where we then had a bunch of unemployed workers that have relocated to the city or lived there in the first place. And those schemes ended. So.
Yeah, I think London is held up often by Olympic committees and countries bidding as like the gold standard of what it was able to achieve. I personally saw exactly that. Like when I lived in London, I lived out near Stratford, right near the Olympic Park, and that area used to be a total like marshland. You would never
very industrial.
Very industrial. A lot of open, unusable space. And all of that transport I would use on a weekly basis and go walking around those facilities. It's like it was a totally rejuvenated part of the city that gave a total bunch of access to people for housing, etc. So that's kind of like
the growing now.
Yeah.
It's flats.
It's
flats
a hub.
Flats.
Yeah. And the idea that I don't know if you've got stats on like what the investment or the cost was there, but coinciding with like the GFC when a lot of that was happening, I'm sure that is like crazy good value now.
So it was $6.5 billion on the transport related infrastructure.
Yep.
On top of that,
you can't dig a hole for that now.
Yeah. You're not doing what they did for sure. Not even close. Having that hard end date, I wonder how that actually helps. But there were other aspects. So they did a lot of investment into cycle lanes. The main motorways coming into the city, they had these priority lanes so they can get athletes in during rush hour and things like that. So that $6.5 billion is, on the surface, looks like a great investment.
Yeah, 100%. And the return on that it would be unbelievable. It's always good to show like probably the best time to do something was 10 years ago and the second best time is now.
One day we'll be like, Sizewell was super cheap. We should have done more of them back then.
The idea of sequencing is interesting. And like, I guess the die is cast probably for something like Brisbane, where it almost feels like the opposite thing has happened, which is not only do you have there's some amount of infrastructure that's front loaded. So the crossover rail is a new kind of metro line going underneath Brisbane. That started years ago, and the date recently got announced as moving, but like it'll be done well in advance of that kind of crunch period. Which
they weren't originally tied. This wasn't an Olympic infrastructure.
I don't think so. I think now it's like conveniently from a marketing perspective tied together. But the fact that would be done before the wave, if that was at the same time, it would be hectic. But on top of that, there is a whole bunch of other government infrastructure spending around rail that is planned. There's a Logan Gold Coast faster rail. There's a road project going out to the Gold Coast, because I think a bunch of the stuff it will happen on the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast. So these are two coasts kind of next to Brisbane, an hour or so away from there. There's a rail project planned to go from Brisbane to the Sunshine Coast, so a Sunshine Coast rail project.
What sort of distance is Brisbane to Sunshine Coast?
What's an hour? Like 100 kilometres, something like that.
Yeah, okay.
In that ballpark. Depends what part of the Sunshine Coast and what part of Brisbane. And then on top of that, Queensland is currently, which is the state that Brisbane is in, is undergoing its biggest ever investment in health infrastructure. And they're spending about $20 billion on hospitals, which currently is like forecast to be 30 or something in overspend. And as I noted, like 14,000 new homes being built. So it definitely feels like that kind of like, the benefit that London had of like being right in the middle of the GFC when it was a great, like almost like stimulus during the lull, and then being able to flow onto that to something like a Crossrail and other infrastructure feels like it was like perfectly timed.
The other benefit that London has is we're so slow to build things that we're always over capacity on everything, whether it's homes, transport, whatever. So when we build something, it is used immediately because we're struggling to keep up.
Uh-huh.
Do you get this similar sense in Brisbane, or do you think they're betting on growth in the future and building on the assumption that it will grow, or is it already?
Yeah, Brisbane is like definitely the fastest growing city in Australia, and kind of spurred through COVID. There was a big shift, and that's like just continued. It's actually, I think, the most expensive or second most expensive now to live. Definite shortage of homes, and it's got a big problem of urban sprawl, just getting wider and wider and wider, which makes transport a big old problem. So transport infrastructure would be a really meaningful legacy to leave, but it's the talk at the moment is just like they keep chopping and changing what they're building. They cancelled something, they can't decide on where a stadium's going. I think, like I said, the die's probably cast for Queensland in terms of like being able to sequence these things, but certainly it doesn't help to keep waiting because it just it condenses the peak, because like you said, it's a hard end date. Unless you want it to open after the Olympics, the end date is hard. So you just do this squishing thing and the peak keeps getting higher.
Yeah, absolutely.
So no meaningful and useful suggestions, but it's going to get crunchy in there for projects being delivered.
Presumably, most of the major works haven't started yet. So you've got probably a couple of years until it really ramps up.
Yeah, so 2027 to 2029 is when they're projecting the peak. They're still arguing about like stadium locations and stuff like that. There's a big tender out that a bunch of people are tendering for with regards to like a managing contractor role for a bunch of the projects, but that keeps getting pushed back. There's like a $14 billion dam project right next door that they're planning to do. That keeps getting pushed back. The government's also like, how the hell are we going to pay for a bunch of these things? So as they scramble to make a bunch of these decisions, it is just chewing time.
Yeah.
And so, you get to a spot where it's like, we got to start making some decisions and commit to some things, because otherwise it gets incrementally more expensive.
Yeah, and already strained resource. If the programs are shorter, you need more and more, so it all becomes
exactly.
more.
Yeah, you just have to crash it. Yeah. Be interesting to see. We will definitely revisit this topic in the future. So jumping to, I guess, a final topic, we talked last week about the $500 billion Stargate announcement, real or not, that came out of the US. which was this combined investment in AI, data center, and infrastructure with Donald Trump, OpenAI, and a bunch of other parties and partners in the project. Somewhat in response, French President Emmanuel Macron announced just in the last handful of days or in the last week, a French-led 109 billion euro investment into French AI infrastructure. The breakdown of this is about 50 billion from the UAE. We'll circle back to investment partners in this because there's some interesting overlap with the US. From the UAE for a 1 gigawatt data center outside of Paris in a nearby town or city, which would make it the largest data center in Europe. Another 20 billion from Canada's Brookfield for AI infrastructure, and 10 billion from BPI France. They're targeting to build 35 new data centers, including this 1 gigawatt one in France. France is definitely positioning itself as kind of like the AI hub of Europe. It is definitely trying to make this not a China, US only story, and that Europe is in the mix. For those that don't know, the major AI model players are largely US based. So there's an OpenAI, which is largely funded by Microsoft, rumored to be almost raising another 40 billion from Japan's SoftBank at the moment at a 300 billion US valuation. Then there's something like a Claude made by Anthropic, which is largely funded by Amazon. And then Elon Musk has a XAI project that is also built the world's largest data center or training cluster. Slightly further into the tier 2 category is a French company, Mistral, which was one of the early companies to get funding in this space. And so I'd say they're probably them plus this investment is probably like the bet that Europe might be making. So yeah, that's a long preamble. But Carlos, is this a positive sign for infrastructure? And it's interesting that it's France leading the way?
Yeah, I think it seems positive. I thought comparing, for example, the US with Stargate, we had the announcement from France, and then we also had an announcement in the UK. They've all gone with 3 different approaches, from centralized to decentralized. You've got the US, which is kind of an R&D, grants and partnerships kind of approach, but basically let big tech deal with it. You've got France, which sounds like this very much like state-driven, orchestrated from the top type investment. And then you've got the UK that are doing sort of their growth zones, partnerships with universities, and trying to improve areas of the country.
Put another way, though, is like the US is like, we know everyone wants to come here, so we'll kind of like open our doors and all this money will come in, like a lot of it from the Middle East or Japan, and even the Japan stuff is like largely funded by the Middle East. So they kind of like know they're playing from this position of strength. Then you've got France, who has like definitely a horse in the race with their local model company, and like it's like you have to now ramp up your spend or basically you're left behind. Like, this is the time to put the chips on the table and have a crack. And they're stumping up some, and then they're obviously partnering with actually one of the same partners that put money into the US, the MGX capital out of the UAE. So that's kind of like they're basically stumping up to position themselves as kind of the leader in Europe and to give Europe a like fighting chance. And then you've got the UK, who's gone, we've got some spots that you could put data centers.
Nice. The thing the UK does have is the universities. So that is quite a significant resource. Some of the best in the world that will partner with these. So I think that's the thing they're betting their chips on. Do
they not know Zoom exists? And like, again, it's just, you can drive like those people can move elsewhere to build the thing. It's like, we've got them, they're in the island.
Yeah. The interesting thing with the UK is the growth zones are quite far from the major cities, so that's going to be a difficult resourcing job. And it's not the most attractive investment. But the thing that I can't stop thinking about is suddenly we've got these announcements with a huge amount of money being thrown at these things. the amount of duplication even between them seems crazy. But at the same time, there was an article the other day around this treaty, and the US and UK saying we're not part of this treaty because they're trying to sort of pool AI resources and be really open and open source everything that we're doing. So I think China, India, France are part of this, but the UK and US said no.
Right.
It feels like they're saying no because they don't want to be tied into regulation pushed on everyone that's part of that community. So the duplication and the amount of money that's being thrown at, ultimately there's probably going to be one or few winners really in the space to try and monetize it. Obviously there's the like defense and things like that you would keep internal, and it's not about monetization, but the retail side of it, that is a headache.
Yeah, I think a state of play right now is that most of the large model players like OpenAI or Anthropic are actively resource constrained. So some of them are not releasing certain models because they couldn't support the inference, or the people wanting to use the thing with the data centers available. That's part of why this investment has kind of come around from a Stargate perspective. From the country and the investor perspective, building a data center, you don't actually care who's using the data center. So it's not like you're betting on Mistral to win or whatever, because ultimately, if OpenAI does, sweep the board or whatever, they're going to need data center capacity in Europe to serve European customers. Ultimately, there's this capacity bottleneck right now, and the big risk is that a large majority of that is being used for training models, and the question is, well, do you still need the capacity to keep training the incremental models going for over time, or do things evolve such that there's more and more efficiency in the way that they train in the application layer and the way that the thing is structured, that demand goes forward? And on the other side, there is the current state of play on inference, which is people asking questions and using the model. The current state of play is a lot of the current applications are still in the early and baby stage of what this will eventually become. And there are, for those that haven't played with them, things like Google's deep reasoning model, deep research model, or OpenAI's deep reasoning model. I think I've jumbled up the names there. But these are things that might think for 10 minutes, 20 minutes at a time on a problem. And that goes from needing 1,000 tokens or 10,000 to thousands and hundreds of thousands of tokens. Basically, units of compute would be one way to think about that. So the demand for inference is predicted to go up 1 million times.
Yeah, the majority of the world's population are either non-AI users or early adopters. So when that ramps up. From a government or from a country perspective, or from a private investor like MGX, out of the UAE, it's a road, or anyone can drive on the road. You're really not making a bet on who's going to win. Yeah. From an infrastructure, like data center point of view, yes. I guess I was thinking there was potentially a lot more money in the actual AI models and everything else that comes with it, which is the thing that you're betting on more than the infrastructure that enables data centers to run.
Yeah, margin wise, I think that the history of the technology industry has shown us that the high margin businesses are in the application layer, which may in fact be on top of OpenAI, so not even that frontier model layer. It remains to be seen what margin there is on that frontier model layer. OpenAI, I think, has quite good margins, but others, even though they're overall losing money, but on the incremental or the marginal serve of the actual compute. The underlying infrastructure, it's comparable to Google data centers and hyperscalers now. It's a more stable and lower margin business, but it's a good business.
Yeah, for sure.
So very, very interesting to see how that plays out and drives increased demand for data center infrastructure.
Yeah, for sure. Right, we're at the end of our time, so I'm going to have to cut us off. Thank you very much, everyone, for tuning into today's show. If you did enjoy the episode, please do think about liking the video or following us on your chosen podcast platform. We appreciate your support, and we'll catch you next week.
Bye-bye.